The intake nurse at the American holding facility in France sees a thin German prisoner of war walk through the door in late April 1945. He is 19 years old. His skin looks gray under the overhead lights, and when he opens his mouth to speak, his gums are black along the edges. He says 3 words in broken English: "I am poisoned." The doctor standing nearby stops writing. Most prisoners complain about hunger, dysentery, or infected wounds. This boy is claiming something else entirely. The exam that follows will reveal a toxin inside his body that should not exist in a teenage soldier, and the source will force everyone in that room to ask a question no one wants to answer. The boy's name is Derrick. He arrived at the American holding facility on April 23, 1945, transported from a temporary collection point near the collapsing German front lines. The war in Europe has less than 2 weeks left, but the intake stations are overflowing with German soldiers who surrendered in the final chaotic days. Derrick is processed like the others. Identification card checked, uniform searched, basic questions asked through an interpreter. But when the intake officer asks if he has any medical complaints, Derrick does not mention lice, foot rot, or hunger. He leans forward and says in slow, careful English, "I am poisoned." The officer does not understand at first. The interpreter repeats it in German, thinking Derrick misspoke, but Derrick shakes his head and repeats the phrase again, "Poisoned." The officer writes it down and sends him to the medical tent. Inside, a United States Army doctor named Captain Harlow is finishing an exam on another prisoner. When Derrick enters, Harlow notices 2 things immediately. The boy's hands are trembling, and his complexion has a dull, ashen tone that does not match typical malnutrition. Harlow asks Derrick to sit down and open his mouth. The gums along the lower teeth are darkened, almost blue-black in places. That is not scurvy. That is not infection. Harlow has seen this discoloration before, but never in a 19-year-old prisoner of war. He orders a full exam and blood work. Derrick is moved to a separate corner of the tent, away from the other prisoners. The nurse who draws his blood notices that Derrick's veins are unusually prominent, and his skin feels cold despite the warm April air. She asks him in German how long he has felt sick. Derrick says he does not remember feeling well. He says the sickness has been with him for months, maybe longer. He says he tried to tell the officers in his unit, but they did not care. The nurse writes it all down and hands the notes to Harlow. The blood sample is sent to the field laboratory in the nearby town. The results come back the next morning. Harlow reads the report twice, then calls for the camp commander. The levels are dangerously high. Derrick has lead in his blood, not trace amounts, not environmental exposure, levels that indicate chronic, sustained poisoning. The commander asks the obvious question: how does a teenage German soldier end up with lead toxicity in the final weeks of the war? Harlow does not have an answer yet, but he knows one thing for certain. Derrick was not poisoned by accident. Harlow returns to the medical tent and sits across from Derrick. He speaks through the interpreter, slowly and carefully. He tells Derrick that the blood test showed lead poisoning. Derrick does not react with surprise. He nods as if this confirms something he already knew. Harlow asks where Derrick thinks the lead came from. Derrick looks down at his hands and says one word: factory. That word opens a new line of questioning. Harlow asks which factory. Derrick says he does not know the name, only that it was somewhere in Western Germany, near the border with France. He says he was sent there in late 1944, after his unit was pulled off the front lines. He was not injured, he was not sick, he was simply reassigned. Harlow asks what Derrick did at the factory. Derrick says he worked with metal. He says they made small components, precision parts for weapons or vehicles. He was never told exactly what the parts were for. He just worked the machines, handled the raw materials, and breathed in the dust. Harlow asks if other workers were sick. Derrick says yes. He says several boys his age started complaining of headaches, nausea, and weakness. Some collapsed at their stations. The factory supervisors told them it was exhaustion or poor diet. No one mentioned poison. No one tested the air or the materials. Derrick says one boy died in January. The supervisors said it was pneumonia. Derrick remembers the boy's gums were black just like his. Harlow makes a note and asks if Derrick was given any protective equipment. Derrick shakes his head. No masks, no gloves, just long shifts and threats of punishment if production slowed down. The interpreter asks Derrick how he ended up in a combat unit if he was working in a factory. Derrick explains that in early April, when the Allies broke through the German defenses, the factory was evacuated. The workers were handed rifles and sent to the front lines as emergency infantry. Derrick says he carried a rifle for less than a week before his unit surrendered. He never fired a shot. He just walked west with his hands up, trying not to collapse from dizziness and nausea. When he reached the American lines, he knew he was dying. That is why he said what he said at intake. He wanted someone to know the truth before it was too late. Let us know in the comments where you are watching this from. Are you in the United States, Germany, the United Kingdom, or somewhere else? If you want to dive even deeper into these untold stories, consider becoming a channel member. You'll get your name mentioned in the video, early access to videos, exclusive content, and direct input on which stories we cover next. Join our inner circle of history keepers. Harlow closes his notebook and tells Derrick he will do everything possible to help. But privately, Harlow is not sure how much can be done. Lead poisoning is cumulative. The damage may already be permanent. We are in the medical tent in France in late April 1945. Now we go back to late 1944, when Derrick was pulled from his unit and sent to the factory. Germany is collapsing. The Reich is hemorrhaging soldiers, equipment, and resources faster than it can replace them. Factories across the country are running on forced labor, teenagers, and the last reserves of industrial capacity. Derrick is part of this system, whether he understands it or not. He is not a skilled worker. He is just a body assigned to a production line in a facility that produces small metal components for the war effort. The factory is located in a town that no longer appears on maps after the war, either destroyed or renamed. It operates in shifts, 24 hours a day. Derrick works the second shift, from noon to midnight. The building has no windows in the production areas, only overhead lights and ventilation fans that barely move the air. The materials Derrick handles include lead-based alloys, solder, and metal dust that coats every surface in the workshop. He is never told what the components are used for. He is just shown how to operate the cutting machine, how to file down the rough edges, and how to load the finished pieces into wooden crates. Within a few weeks, Derrick begins to notice symptoms. His hands start shaking in the mornings. His head aches constantly. He loses his appetite and begins vomiting after meals. Other boys on his shift report similar problems. One boy, a 16-year-old named Dieter, collapses at his station in December. He is carried out and does not return. The supervisors say he was transferred to another facility. Derrick never sees him again. Another boy starts having seizures in January. The supervisors call it epilepsy and remove him from the line. Derrick remembers the boy's gums were blackened, just like his own. That is when Derrick realizes the factory is killing them. He tries to report his symptoms to the shift supervisor, a civilian factory manager who works for the Reich's armaments ministry. The supervisor dismisses Derrick's complaints and tells him to drink more water and eat his rations. Derrick insists something is wrong with the air or the materials. The supervisor accuses Derrick of trying to avoid work and threatens to report him to the military police. In Nazi Germany in late 1944, a report like that could mean execution. Derrick stops complaining. He keeps working, even as his body weakens and his vision begins to blur. He has no choice. If you are enjoying this story and want more untold accounts from World War II prisoners of war, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We are bringing you stories that most history books never covered. In early April 1945, the Western Front collapses completely. American and British forces push deep into German territory. The factory where Derrick works receives orders to evacuate. The machinery is dismantled and loaded onto trains. The workers are told to gather their belongings and prepare for reassignment. Derrick and the other boys expect to be sent to another factory further east. Instead, they are handed rifles, helmets, and ammunition. They are now soldiers. Derrick does not understand why. He has basic training from 1944, but he is not fit for combat. He can barely stand without feeling dizzy. His hands shake so badly he struggles to load the rifle. The officer in charge does not care. Germany needs bodies on the front lines, not excuses. Derrick and the others are loaded onto trucks and driven west toward the advancing American forces. They are told to hold a defensive position along a river crossing. They dig shallow foxholes and wait. Derrick knows this is pointless. The war is over. Everyone knows it, but no one is allowed to say it out loud. The American forces arrive 2 days later. They do not attack. They simply call out in German, ordering the defenders to surrender. One by one, the German soldiers stand up and walk toward the American lines with their hands raised. Derrick is among them. He drops his rifle, raises his hands, and walks slowly across the field. His legs feel like they are made of lead. He wonders if this is what dying feels like. When he reaches the American soldiers, one of them asks in broken German if he is injured. Derrick shakes his head. He is not injured. He is poisoned. He is taken to a collection point, then transferred to the holding facility where Captain Harlow will eventually examine him. During the transport, Derrick sits on the floor of a truck with a dozen other prisoners. Most of them are relieved to be out of the war. Derrick is just trying to stay conscious. His vision blurs in and out. His stomach cramps. He tastes metal in his mouth constantly. He knows his body is failing. He also knows that if he dies now, no one will ever know what happened at the factory. That is why he decides to speak. That is why, when the intake officer asks if he has medical complaints, Derrick says the words that will save his life. We are back in the medical tent in France. Captain Harlow has the blood test results, but he needs more information. He consults with a toxicology specialist from the field hospital in the next town. The specialist confirms the diagnosis: chronic lead poisoning, consistent with months of occupational exposure. The levels in Derrick's blood are high enough to cause permanent neurological damage if untreated. The specialist asks where Derrick was exposed. Harlow explains the factory story. The specialist is not surprised. He says forced labor facilities across Germany were notorious for unsafe conditions, especially in the final year of the war when production quotas trumped worker safety. Harlow asks what can be done. The specialist says the priority is to stop further exposure, which has already happened now that Derrick is in Allied custody. The next step is supportive care: hydration, nutrition, rest, and monitoring for complications like seizures or kidney failure. There is no antidote that can reverse the damage already done. The lead will gradually leave Derrick's system over months or years, but the neurological effects may be permanent. Harlow asks about the other workers at the factory. The specialist says they are likely dead, still poisoned, or scattered among the millions of displaced persons flooding through Europe in the final weeks of the war. Finding them would be nearly impossible. Harlow returns to Derrick and explains the diagnosis in simple terms. Derrick listens without emotion. He asks if he will die. Harlow says no, not immediately, but he also cannot promise full recovery. Derrick asks about the other boys from the factory. Harlow says he does not know. Derrick nods. He expected that answer. Harlow asks if Derrick remembers the name of the factory or the town. Derrick says he was never told the official name. He only remembers the train station where they arrived, a small town near the French border, bombed heavily by the time they evacuated. Harlow writes it down, knowing it may never lead anywhere. The next few days are critical. Derrick is kept in the medical tent under observation. His symptoms stabilize but do not improve. The tremors continue. The nausea persists. Harlow orders additional blood tests to track the lead levels over time. The numbers drop slightly but remain dangerously elevated. Derrick sleeps most of the day, too weak to do much else. When he is awake, he stares at the tent ceiling and says very little. Harlow wonders what Derrick is thinking. Is he relieved to be alive? Or is he haunted by the boys who did not make it out of the factory? Harlow does not ask. Some questions are too heavy for words. We need to step back and understand the scale of what Derrick experienced, because his story is not isolated. By 1945, Nazi Germany operated thousands of forced labor facilities, producing everything from ammunition to aircraft parts. These facilities employed millions of workers, prisoners of war, concentration camp inmates, and conscripted civilians. Safety standards were non-existent. Exposure to toxic materials was common. Lead poisoning was just one of many occupational hazards that killed or disabled workers during the war. The exact number of deaths from industrial poisoning is unknown. because records were destroyed or never kept in the first place. But estimates suggest tens of thousands of workers suffered from lead, mercury, and chemical exposure during the final years of the war. WWII's factory likely employed several hundred workers at its peak. If even 10% experienced symptoms like his, that means dozens of boys were poisoned in a single facility. Multiply that across the Reich's industrial network, and the human cost becomes staggering. These were not combat deaths. These were not casualties of bombing raids. These were deaths by negligence, driven by a regime that valued production over people. WWII survived because he was reassigned to the front lines at the exact moment the war ended. If he had stayed at the factory another month, he would have died there. If he had been captured a week earlier or later, he might never have encountered a doctor like Harlow. His survival is a combination of timing, luck, and the fact that he spoke up when it mattered. The medical records from WWII's case are part of a larger archive of prisoner of war health assessments conducted by Allied forces in 1945. These records document a range of conditions: malnutrition, tuberculosis, untreated wounds, and occupational diseases like WWII's lead poisoning. The records were classified for decades after the war, then gradually released to researchers. WWII's file is now stored in a military archive in the United States, one of thousands that tell similar stories of suffering, survival, and systemic cruelty. Most of these stories never made it into the history books. WWII's story is an exception, only because he had the courage to say 3 words at intake: "I am poisoned." We are in France in early May 1945. The war in Europe ends on May 8th. WWII is still in the medical tent when the news arrives. The other prisoners cheer. WWII does not. He is too weak to celebrate. For him, the war ending means only one thing: he will not be sent back to the factory. But it does not mean he is safe. His body is still poisoned. His future is still uncertain. Harlow continues to monitor WWII's condition over the following weeks. The lead levels in his blood decrease slowly, but WWII's symptoms persist. The tremors remain. The nausea comes and goes. He develops sensitivity to light and sound, classic signs of neurological damage. Harlow arranges for WWII to be transferred to a larger hospital facility in Belgium, where specialists can provide more advanced care. Before WWII leaves, Harlow sits down with him one last time. He tells WWII that he did the right thing by speaking up. He tells WWII that his testimony may help identify other poisoning cases among the prisoner population. WWII asks if anyone will be held accountable for what happened at the factory. Harlow does not answer. The truth is, he does not know. The factory supervisors, the armaments officials, the Nazi leadership responsible for the labor system, most of them are either dead, in hiding, or about to be tried for war crimes unrelated to industrial poisoning. WWII's case is a footnote in a much larger story of atrocity. Justice, if it comes at all, will be incomplete. WWII is transferred to Belgium in mid-May. The hospital there has a dedicated ward for prisoners with chronic illnesses. WWII shares a room with 3 other German soldiers, all recovering from tuberculosis. The doctors in Belgium conduct additional tests and confirm Harlow's diagnosis. They add a new assessment. WWII likely has permanent nerve damage in his hands and may experience cognitive difficulties for the rest of his life. There is no treatment that can reverse this. The doctors recommend rest, nutrition, and time. WWII is given better food, clean clothing, and a bed with sheets. It is the first time in months he has felt even remotely human, but the relief is tinged with bitterness. He knows he will never be the same. The hospital records from Belgium note that WWII is cooperative but withdrawn. He does not speak much to the other patients. He spends most of his time staring out the window, watching the rain. The nurses try to engage him in conversation, but he gives short answers and then goes silent. One nurse writes in her log that WWII seems to be haunted by something he cannot name. That is an accurate description. WWII is haunted by the factory, by the boys who died there, and by the knowledge that no one except a handful of doctors and nurses will ever care about what happened. The world is focused on the concentration camps, the battlefields, and the reconstruction of Europe. Factory workers poisoned by lead do not make headlines. WWII understands this. It does not make it any easier we are in Belgium in June 1945. Captain Harlow, now reassigned to a different facility, writes a report summarizing WWII's case. He includes the medical findings, Durick's testimony about the factory, and a recommendation that Allied authorities investigate the facility and identify other potential poisoning victims. The report is submitted to the United States Army Medical Corps, which forwards it to a War Crimes Investigation Unit. The unit reviews the report and determines that it does not meet the threshold for prosecution. The factory was not a concentration camp. The poisoning, while tragic, was classified as negligent labor practices rather than deliberate murder. The case is filed and forgotten. Harlow is frustrated but not surprised. He has seen this pattern before. Atrocities that fit the narrative, gas chambers, mass executions, torture, are prioritized for prosecution. Atrocities that are more ambiguous, more bureaucratic, more industrial are sidelined. The Nazi regime killed millions of people in ways that were not always spectacular or cinematic. Slow poisoning in a factory is one of those ways. It does not generate outrage. It does not demand justice. It just fades into the background noise of wartime suffering. Harlow keeps a copy of his report in his personal files, hoping that someday someone will care enough to follow up. That day never comes. Durick, meanwhile, has no idea that an investigation was even considered. He is still in the hospital in Belgium, slowly regaining strength. By July, the doctors determine that he is stable enough to be transferred to a prisoner of war repatriation camp. He is loaded onto a truck with other German prisoners and driven to a camp near the German border. The camp is overcrowded and chaotic. Thousands of German soldiers are waiting to be processed and sent home. Durick waits for 3 weeks before his name is called. He is given a discharge document, a small amount of cash, and a train ticket to his hometown in southern Germany. He boards the train in early August, 6 months after he started working in the factory that nearly killed him. The train ride takes 2 days. Durick sleeps most of the way, his body still weak and his mind still numb. When he finally arrives at his hometown station, he barely recognizes the place. The buildings are damaged. The streets are empty. His family home is still standing, but his parents are not there. A neighbor tells Durick that his father was killed in an air raid in March, and his mother moved to live with relatives in Bavaria. Durick does not have the strength to travel further. He stays with the neighbor for a few days, then moves into a room above a bakery. He finds work as a janitor, the only job he can manage with his trembling hands. He never speaks about the factory. He never tells anyone he was poisoned. He just survives, one day at a time, in a country that has been destroyed and is trying to forget. We are in Germany in the years after the war. Durick is alive, but he is not well. The tremors in his hands never fully disappear. He develops chronic headaches that last for days. His memory becomes unreliable. He forgets appointments, loses track of conversations, and sometimes cannot remember where he is. The doctors he consults in the post-war years tell him there is nothing they can do. Lead poisoning, they explain, causes permanent damage to the nervous system. Durick will have to learn to live with it. He does, but it is not easy. He loses jobs because of his unreliability. He struggles to maintain relationships. He becomes isolated, a ghost in his own life. In the 1950s, Durick reads a newspaper article about war crimes trials. He wonders if anyone from the factory was ever held accountable. He writes a letter to the Allied occupation authorities, describing his experience and asking if any investigation took place. He receives no response. He writes again a year later. Again, no response. He eventually stops trying. The world has moved on. Germany is rebuilding. The past is being buried under new construction, new industries, and new politics. Durick's story is not part of that narrative. It is too small, too specific, too uncomfortable. He accepts this, not because he agrees with it, but because he has no other choice. By the 1960s, Durick has learned to manage his symptoms. He works part-time jobs that do not require fine motor skills. He avoids crowds and loud environments, which trigger his headaches. He lives alone in a small apartment in the same town where he grew up. He never marries. He has no children. He speaks to almost no one about his past. The few people who know his story do not ask questions. It is easier that way. Durick is not bitter exactly. He is just tired. Tired of carrying a truth that no one wants to hear. Tired of being a footnote in a war that produced millions of footnotes just like him. Durick lives into his 70s. He dies in the early 2000s, alone in his apartment, from complications related to heart disease. The obituary in the local newspaper is 2 lines long. Name, age, date of death. There is no mention of the factory, no mention of the poisoning, no mention of the fact that de Rick was one of thousands of boys who were slowly killed by the machinery of the Nazi war economy. His body is cremated. His ashes are scattered in a municipal cemetery. There is no headstone, no memorial, just silence. The factory where de Rick worked was demolished in the 1950s. The site is now a parking lot. The boys who died there have no graves. Their names are not recorded. Their families, if they are still alive, do not know what happened. De Rick's story survives only because a single American doctor wrote a report that was filed away and forgotten, then rediscovered decades later by a historian researching occupational diseases in World War II. De Rick's story is not unique, but it is uniquely documented. Most forced laborers who suffered occupational poisoning during World War II left no records. They died in factories, camps, or hospitals without anyone noting the cause. Their bodies were buried or burned. Their families were told they died of disease or exhaustion. The truth was buried with them. De Rick's case survived because Captain Harlow was diligent enough to document it, and because de Rick himself was strong enough to speak up at the moment when it mattered most. That combination of documentation and testimony is rare. It gives us a window into a part of the war that is often overlooked. The industrial machinery of death that operated alongside the more visible horrors of combat and genocide. Lead poisoning, like de Rick experienced, was preventable. Protective equipment existed. Ventilation systems existed. Medical monitoring existed. But in Nazi Germany in 1944 and 1945, none of that mattered. The regime prioritized production over people. Workers were expendable. Safety was a luxury the Reich could not afford. This was not a secret. Factory managers knew the risks. Armaments officials knew the risks. They simply decided that meeting production quotas was more important than protecting the boys operating the machines. De Rick paid the price for that decision. So did thousands of others whose names we will never know. The post-war silence around cases like de Rick's is also revealing. Allied authorities prosecuted high-profile war criminals, but largely ignored systemic labor abuses. The focus was on concentration camps and extermination programs, not on factory conditions. This was partly a matter of priorities. There were too many crimes to prosecute, and partly a matter of framing. Poisoning workers through negligence did not fit the narrative of Nazi evil that the Allies wanted to emphasize. It was too mundane, too industrial, too close to the kinds of labor abuses that existed in other countries, including the Allied nations themselves. So cases like de Rick's were filed away and forgotten. Justice, when it came at all, was selective. De Rick's survival is a testament to his resilience and to the intervention of a single doctor who took his complaint seriously. But survival is not the same as recovery. De Rick lived with the consequences of his poisoning for the rest of his life. He lost opportunities, relationships, and decades of health. He carried a truth that no one wanted to hear. His story asks us to remember not just the dramatic moments of history, the battles, the liberations, the trials, but also the quieter, slower forms of cruelty that destroyed lives just as surely as bullets and bombs. The factory that poisoned de Rick is gone. The boys who died there are forgotten.